In today's video, we're going to take a look at new functionality that allows integrating Nerdio Manager for Enterprise with Azure Stack HCI. So before we dig into the specific functionality that Nerdio Manager provides, let's review what Azure Stack HCI is. And it is basically a new type of hypervisor that can be installed on hardware and hosted on premises in your own data center, and then be integrated into your Azure environment and be managed and have visibility into that on-premises deployment of a hypervisor with your Azure portal. AVD is now compatible and can run on top of Azure Stack HCI, which allows customers to extend their Azure Virtual Desktops and not only have them run in the cloud in Azure, but also run on premises with Azure Stack HCI. Some of the common use cases are around data residency or performance. When, for instance, you cannot move your data or applications into the cloud, and putting desktops in the cloud would mean that the access to that data that stays on premises may be slower than desired and wouldn't have a good end user experience. So now it's possible to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop on premises as well as in the cloud. So in order to use the Azure Stack HCI integration in the Nerdio Manager, you first of all need an Azure Stack HCI cluster. It can be a small as single node or obviously multi-node type of a cluster, and it must be registered with your Azure subscription. Once that is done, you're going to go into settings, go into integrations, and you will see a new tile here called Azure Stack HCI clusters. And this gives us the option to link one or more Azure Stack HCI clusters to our Azure environment. Once we click link, it is going to enumerate all of the registered clusters that are connected to any of the subscription that Nerdio Manager has visibility of. So in my case, I have two clusters and they're both already registered. So this list is going to come up empty in just a few seconds. But you can see, actually, no, I do have one more, and I have two that are already linked. So if I select this HCI cluster, the next thing I need to provide is the app ID of the app registration that was created during the HCI cluster registration. So this is going to be under your app registrations in Azure portal. And it's going to be the app registration that has the -arc, ARC at the end of the name. And what this particular app registration must have, and it will have that permission by default if you're using the app registration that the cluster used, it's going to have the Azure Connected Machine onboarding role on the Azure subscription where the Azure Stack HCI cluster resides. Again, that permission is typically there by default in place already. So we are going to type in our cluster app ID here. We're going to generate from the Azure portal an app secret and type it in here. Then in this field, we're going to type in the default path where our images or VHD or VHDX files that are going to serve as images for the on-premises AVD session host VMs, where those are going to reside. This could be an empty folder somewhere on the cluster storage in our on-premises environment. We're also going to specify a default path where VMs are going to be stored. So once those VMs are created from the images, they're going to be stored here. And here we're going to specify the name of our virtual switch. The virtual switch is going to be something we will configure when building the HCI cluster. The next set of options is fairly automated. There's really nothing to change here. This is going to be the name of a new automation account that will be created in Azure. There's going to be a hybrid worker group created. And here we're going to select our hybrid workers, which are typically going to be your cluster nodes from the cluster that's selected up here. And finally, we need to provide credentials on the domain where the HCI cluster is registered. This may or may not be the same domain as your Azure Virtual Desktop deployment is using, but it could be. And this user needs to have the permission to create, delete, power on, power off VMs in the HCI cluster deployment. Once we specify all this information and click OK, that's going to go ahead and connect to the cluster and test everything. And once it is connected, it's going to look something like this. So I have two clusters linked. I have one of them set as default, and I have a test button. And if I click test and click OK, you'll see there's going to be a task that will be queued up here. And then once this task completes successfully, we'll know that the cluster is operational and is accessible. If we click on this cluster, we can make changes to these settings. You can see I can change my paths that I specified, my switch name, and I can change the hybrid workers that I'm using. At least one hybrid worker is necessary, and it provides you a list of the possible options. So that's our step number one. Step number one is linking Nerdio Manager to a registered Azure Stack HCI cluster. Step number two is creating an image that can be used to deploy AVD session hosts. So we're going to go under images, and from our images screen, we can take any of our existing Azure images, whether new or existing ones that we've worked with previously. And as long as it is stored in the Azure Compute Gallery, we will see a new option at the bottom of the drop-down menu called Export to HCI. If we select Export to HCI, it will ask us to select which cluster we want to export it to. Once we select the cluster, it will give us all the nodes that it can see and ask us to select the node. It's going to ask us for the image path, which is the same path that was specified during the process of linking. We're going to give this an image a name. Be sure to include a version in the file name so you can identify the file based on the version. And if this image is replicated to multiple Azure regions, we can choose which region is geographically and physically closest to our Azure Stack HCI cluster. Once we click OK, this is going to begin the export process and is going to download this image from Azure, from this region specified right here, down to our cluster in the shared storage location. And once that's done, we will begin provisioning VMs from that image. So the concept behind image management with Azure Stack HCI is you do all of your image management in Azure the way you're used to. With Nerdio Manager, you can automate patching, you can do versioning, you can do staging. All of the advanced image management capabilities work exactly the same, with the final step of making that image available on your on-premises cluster by selecting that Export to HCI button. So that's our step number two. Step number one was linking the cluster. Step number two is exporting the image. Step number three is creating our host pools and our session hosts inside of those host pools. So if we go to workspaces and open up my lab workspace here, you will see a new menu option under dynamic and static hosts now called hybrid host pools. Hybrid host pools are the ones that have an on-premises component to them through Azure Stack HCI. So if we click on hybrid host pools, we have the option to add an HCI host pool. And this experience is exactly the same as adding a traditional host pool. And then once the host pool is added and we open it up, then we can add session hosts into this host pool. So if we click on add session host, we can select how many hosts we want to create. Let's say we want to create 25. We can give this a name that's going to be as a prefix of the actual VM names. We can select which cluster to provision those VMs on, which node to use. And then we can choose how many cores we want per VM and how much RAM we want to assign. And you can see instead of selecting an image size that has predetermined CPU to RAM ratio, we have more granular capabilities of being able to adjust these to be exactly what we want them to be. This is where our network switch name goes. And then finally here, we get to select from a list of all the images that we've previously exported to our HCI cluster. So I'm going to go ahead and select my G2 Golden Image VHDX. This is our directory or the folder path that is where VMs will be created. We can select whether we want Hyper-V Generation 1 or Generation 2 VMs to be used. And finally, choose a resource group that is going to contain the Azure Arc objects for these new session hosts. Once we click OK, this is going to create these 25 VMs. And those VMs will be created on premises, automatically joined to the domain. They will be registered with AVD, and they will come up in this list and look just like this. So that's our step number 3. So step number 1 is linking the cluster. Step number 2 is exporting our image. Step number 3 is creating a host pool and creating session hosts inside. Now, what you'll notice is that these session hosts have an additional value here called Arc status. And Arc is a way to integrate VMs into Azure and be able to control them from within the Azure control plane through things like extensions. And once these VMs are created, you can see their status is now available, which means that users can now connect to their normal AVD workspace, and they will see this new host pool, if assuming they're entitled to it, and they will be getting a session directly on an on-premises environment. Once these hosts exist, you have full control over them, just as if they were Azure hosts. You can power them on and off, deactivate them for drain mode. You can restart them. You can run individual scripted actions or multiple scripted actions if you'd like. And you can even resize or reimage either individual hosts or all of the hosts in the host pool. So when you go to reimage, you can select which image path you want to choose. You can change your RAM size and your CPU, and all of this works exactly like it does for Azure-based VMs. So this is it for our first video on this topic of Azure Stack HCI. There's a lot more to talk about around auto scaling and auto creation of VMs. But basically, if you know how to manage your AVD environment in Azure with Nerdio Manager, as long as you link your cluster and export your images, all the other management looks exactly the same as it does with native AVD. I hope you found this useful, and you now know that AVD can run even on premises. See you in the next video.